It's very early in the morning on August 27, 2006. In Lexington, Kentucky, the sky is still dark and everything is quiet, except for one small jet that has just pulled away from the terminal building. This regional jet soon lines up for a routine departure towards Atlanta, and whilst everything about this flight seems absolutely normal, a momentary lapse in judgment will soon change everything. Comair Flight 5191 was an early morning passenger service from Bluegrass Airport in Lexington, Kentucky over to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International. It was planned as just an hour-long regional hop intended to feed passengers into Delta's main base, and the flight had been scheduled to depart just after 6 o'clock in the morning on August 27, 2006, and there was nothing unusual about the route, the timing or the mission. Flights like this departed Lexington and other small airports often several times every day, with business travelers, commuters and connecting passengers relying on them for their transport to fortress hubs in cities like Atlanta, where onward journeys to other destinations throughout the US or beyond could then ensue. Now, the operator on this particular flight was Comair, an airline founded in 1977 that by the mid-2000s had grown into one of the largest regional carriers in the United States. Comair was also a wholly owned subsidiary of Delta Airlines, and its flights were marketed and sold under the Delta Connection brand. So, from a passenger's perspective, a Comair flight was simply a part of the Delta network, and it was operated to the same regulatory standards and with the crews trained under the same Part 121 framework as any major airline. Now, the company flew primarily on short-haul routes, just like the one that we're looking at today, and the airplane assigned to Flight 5191 was a Bombardier CL-600-2 Bravo 19, better known as the CRJ-100, with this particular one being registered as November 431 Charlie Alpha. It was a twin-engine regional jet, configured to carry just 50 passengers, and by the morning of this flight, it had accumulated just over 14,000 total flight hours. Now, there were no deferred maintenance items that would affect this flight, nor any indications of technical issues that would play a role in what was about to happen. So from a systems and airworthiness standpoint, this airplane was perfectly fit to fly. And that brings us to the crew, who had been rostered to operate this morning flight. The captain was 35 years old and had been hired by Comair back in 1999 and then upgraded to captain in 2004. By this day, he had logged approximately 4,710 hours of total flight time, including just over 3,000 hours on the CRJ. And he had flown in and out of Lexington multiple times before, including during night. Now, somewhat unusually, his first officer was even more experienced. He was 44 years old and had accumulated roughly 6,560 total flight hours, with about 3,560 of those being flown on the CRJ. Now, before joining Comair back in 2002, he had flown for another regional airline where he had served as a captain and simulator instructor, making him more experienced and knowledgeable than most other first officers. But at Comair, he was so far only qualified as second in command, but was regarded by instructors and check airmen in the company as methodical and thorough. And just like the captain, he too had prior experience in operating out of Lexington, including at nighttime. But this was the first time that these two pilots had been paired together, which isn't uncommon in many airlines consisting of thousands of pilots. That's why we have robust standard operating procedures, so that people from any background and experience can work together instantly. Now, both of these pilots were described by their colleagues as quiet, professional and very capable, and neither had any record of accidents, incidents or training deficiencies. So as far as anyone could tell, they were the very definition of professionals. In any case, the crew reported for duty at approximately time 05:15 in the morning, and at that point the sunrise was still almost 2 hours away, and the terminal was quiet in a way that small airports can often be. According to airline staff who interacted with them, the pilots appeared alert, conversational and completely normal in every sense, and we also know that they had received the appropriate amount of rest before this flight. So they soon collected their paperwork, which included weather information, notices to airmen or NOTAMs, as well as their flight plans, and then they prepared to head out to the ramp where their aircraft was parked. In the low light of the morning, the CRJ sat quietly at the gate, almost indistinguishable from any of the other regional jets parked nearby. So pre-flight inspections soon began, as they always do, split between the cockpit and the walk-around, with each pilot focused on his own set of tasks. But it was during this phase that the first small error of the morning occurred, one that would later take on more meaning than it seemed to deserve at the time. You see, after the pilots had boarded, turned on the APU and started the setup process, a ramp agent came by and noticed that they had boarded the wrong aircraft. He now pointed this out and then redirected them over to the correct airplane, but this probably caused some red faces. And since this error was caught quickly, no real damage was done and the crew simply just moved on with plenty of time left to spare. Now, if nothing else had happened this morning, that mistake would have been quickly forgotten, filed in as the sort of thing that happens occasionally on a dark ramp with multiple identical airplanes parked in close proximity. But this was also an early reminder that even at the very beginning of the day, when everyone should be rested, attention could drift, just enough for mistakes and assumptions to slip in. Once aboard the correct aircraft, the pre-flight was then restarted and proceeded normally. The cockpit voice recorder soon captured routine checklist calls, navigation setup and brief personal exchanges between the two pilots as they configured their airplane for departure. Since this was the first flight of the day, there was no pre-planning on which pilot would be flying, so the captain offered the first flight to the first officer while he would be acting as pilot monitoring. Now this is a strategy that I often use myself when I fly with a new first officer, because it gives me time to evaluate their skills and also give me as a captain more time for paperwork, etc. on the first flight. Now, aside from the two pilots, the only other crew member was one flight attendant in the main cabin, and when she had welcomed the 47 passengers that were booked on the flight, it brought the total number of people on board up to 50. So at time 0548, the first officer contacted clearance delivery and received the flight's IFR clearance over to Atlanta, which he then read back correctly. The controller confirmed that runway 22 was in use, a detail that also matched the automatic terminal information service that the crew had already listened to, so everything was going according to plan. And when we're on the subject of plans, when it comes to traveling, you really need a plan. Traveling can often be exhausting, with jet lag, dehydration and a stiff neck after having spent hours in an uncomfortable seat. So all you really want to do when you land is to get to your hotel, and the very last thing you want is to be hunting for a phone shop to get a local SIM card for your data. But I've got good news for you. Why not sort out that data coverage before you even leave home? With today's sponsor, Holafly, that's exactly what you get, and it is super convenient. Holafly is the world's first truly international mobile operator, keeping you connected in over 160 destinations worldwide. Their Holafly plans are monthly eSIM subscriptions designed for people who travel often or who work remotely. Now, to use them, you just install the eSIM once from your couch and then you're ready to use it everywhere you travel. No more confusing SIM shops or crazy roaming charges. You can choose from two different plans, the 25GB Lite plan or, my choice, the Unlimited plan, which I will use when I go to Thailand this week actually. Both of them include global coverage, hotspot access, rolling monthly billing and the freedom to cancel at any time. And here comes a really cool thing. When you pause or cancel your plan, your eSIM will automatically switch over to its always on mode, where you get 1 free gigabyte of data per month for emergencies, which means that even without paying, you will never be left without connection. So to try Holafly out, go to sim.holafly.com/plans and get 10% off monthly with the code MENTOR. That's sim.holafly.com/plans. Thank you, Holafly, and let's get back to the video. Now, Bluegrass Airport is not a large or complex airport. And for those who were familiar with it, like this crew were, taxi routes and departures could seem almost self-explanatory. Back in 2006, the airport was built around two intersecting runways, with nearly all commercial traffic using runway 22, which was the longest one. It measured just over 7,000 feet, or 2,130 meters from threshold to end, and was 150 feet or 45 meters wide. It was also equipped with runway edge lights, centerline lights, and all of the visual infrastructure expected for the use of transport category aircraft. But then, crossing the main runway at an angle was runway 26, a much shorter runway, measuring only about 3,500 feet or 1,067 meters in length, which meant that it was only half as long as runway 22, and therefore intended only for general aviation traffic. Because of that, its equipment was also much more Spartan than runway 22. It had, for example, no runway edge lighting, no approach lighting system, and even though its paved width was also 150 feet, the usable width painted on it was only half of that, at 75 feet or 22.5 meters. In terms of total traffic volume, only around 2% would ever use that runway, so air traffic control didn't think of it much, especially not in connection with commercial traffic. Now, the physical connection between these two runways was taxiway Alpha, which was the standard taxiway used by airliners that were leaving the apron area for runway 22. So the aircraft would taxi out from the ramp, then normally roll straight across runway 26 and continue only a few hundred feet further to reach the holding point for runway 22. On that routing, there were no sharp turns, no complex intersections, except for that runway, or any long stretches of taxiways between one runway and the other. So you can maybe see why crews familiar with this place would treat taxiing from the gate to the runway as something very, very simple to do. Now, according to Comair's procedures at the time, a full and detailed taxi briefing was to be completed on the first flight of the day, no matter how easy the taxi routing was. But on this morning, the captain chose to skip that step, just saying standard taxi, likely because of just how easy it seemed. Now that might feel very logical, but all standard operating procedures are there for a reason, as we will soon see. It should also be mentioned that at the time, air traffic control procedures also reinforced that sense of complacency. A taxi clearance issued to runway 22, for example, automatically authorized an aircraft to cross runway 26 along that route unless the controller specifically instructed the crew to hold short of it. And that in turn meant that the crews were not required to stop before runway 26 or even to call out that they were crossing it. So in practice, this often blurred the mental distinction between taxiway and runway, particularly when the crossing was one that the pilots expected to make every single time that they departed. And on top of this, there was also an added complication on this morning. You see, Bluegrass Airport was undergoing some construction at the time, and while changes were modest, they had generated a series of NOTAMs covering displaced thresholds, closed taxiway segments, and lighting outages. Among those NOTAMs was one stating that the runway end identifier lights on runway 22, which is the main runway, were out of service. Now, the crew of Flight 5191 had already discussed this during their takeoff briefing, and the first officer had personally observed a similar condition on a previous arrival into Lexington, where he said that the lights were out all over the place. And as a result of this, the crew now adjusted their expectations for what runway 22 might look like in the dark, and this mattered. You see, it was still more than 30 minutes before sunrise when this flight was supposed to depart, and beyond the boundaries of the airport, there were no city lights or other distinctive illuminated terrain features to define the horizon. So once the jet had lined up with the runway and advanced the thrust levels for takeoff, the runway itself and any associated lights became the primary visual cues, especially on a cloudy night like this one. Now, the safeguards for navigating around the airport are all procedural and built on the assumption that pilots will always consciously verify their position, but also that controllers will, when able, visually monitor the movements. But on this morning, there was only one person working in the tower, which wasn't unusual, but worth remembering. Anyway, as Comair Flight 5191 prepared for taxi, nothing about the airport's layout, the ongoing construction work or the changes in lighting seemed to the pilots as any major issue. The tower soon informed the crew that their flight plan had been accepted, and their subsequent IFR clearance read, "Cleared to Atlanta Airport via Bowling Green, Erlin 2 arrival, maintained 6000, expect flight level 270, 10 minutes after departure. Departures 120.75, squawk 6641. And once that was read back and runway 22 had been confirmed as the departure runway, the crew turned their attention to getting the airplane moving. So, just after 6 o'clock, with both engines running and the cockpit configured for taxi, the first officer keyed the microphone and requested taxi clearance. The tower controller quickly responded, "Comair 191, taxi to runway 22. And that was it. Like I mentioned before, that clearance implicitly authorized the aircraft to cross runway 26 on the way out to the holding point, so the captain now released the brakes and the CRJ began rolling away from the gate along taxiway Alpha. The atmosphere in the cockpit at this point was relaxed and familiar, just like the rest of their morning had been. Checklist items were called and acknowledged, radios were monitored, and the airplane moved steadily through an otherwise quiet airport. But as they proceeded, the cockpit voice recorder also captured conversations that had nothing to do with the airplane, the airport, or the departure. Instead, the two pilots now started talking casually, picking up a discussion that had begun earlier in the morning about pay rates at their airline and competitors, working conditions and hours, all in a very relaxed and casual fashion. Now, to most people, this type of chatter might seem completely harmless, the kind of things that co-workers always discuss, but in this case it was clearly outside the realm of something that we refer to as sterile cockpit. Sterile cockpit rules, which are both FAA regulations and airline policies, prohibit non-essential conversations during critical phases of flight. And those phases include the taxi, takeoff and climb, and later on the approach, landing and taxi in. And that's precisely because these are the segments where situational awareness matters the most. So the taxi phase is also a critical phase of flight. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. As we are moving in and out from the runway, we crews must keep close track of our exact position, monitor any other aircraft that's moving around us, confirm signage and markings, and ensure that the mental picture in our heads matches where our airplane actually is, which might sound easy, but in reality can be a bit tricky. And also, in fact, a vast majority of aircraft damages happens on the ground, so it is really super important to be extra vigilant here. But none of that vigilance seemed to be present in this cockpit. Instead, the atmosphere remained unhurried and conversational. At one point, during the pre-takeoff and taxi briefing, the first officer read back the runway as 24 and was gently corrected by the captain. And in fact, this easygoing and relaxed attitude had been present from the very start of the day, with the captain repeatedly telling the first officer to complete items at his leisure. Now, I have been in situations like this myself, especially when flying with a very nice, competent and experienced colleague. And it is always tempting to keep a relaxed attitude in the cockpit then. But there is a sharp line between relaxed and unprofessional. And as a captain, it's always up to me to make sure that this line is never crossed. Anyway, as the aircraft now continued taxiing, the first officer worked through the taxi checklist, and his voice remained calm and measured as he read through the items, though at one point his tone suggested a yawn as he confirmed, "Radar terrain displays taxi checks complete." Now, investigators would later note this moment, not as proof of fatigue, but as a reminder that this was an early morning departure during a circadian low period. That's when alertness can be subtly dipping down, even when crews feel rested and capable, which I guess most of us has experienced at some point, right? A short time later, the aircraft slowed down and came to a stop, just short of the indicated holding point for runway 26. Now, for anyone observing, that might have looked perfectly normal, but this stop was actually the first clear deviation from what should have happened. and the first link in the chain towards an accident. Remember, with their taxi clearance to runway 22 and under the procedures in place at the time, the crew was only supposed to hold short of runway 22, not runway 26. Taxiway Alpha crossed runway 26 directly, so the expected thing to do was for the aircraft just to roll straight across that runway and then continue to the holding point for runway 22. So the fact that they had now stopped at runway 26 meant that they were now at the wrong holding point. But inside of the cockpit, this mistake now went completely unrecognized. There was no call-out identifying the runway they had stopped at, nor any other verbal call to verify their position at all. Instead, on the cockpit voice recorder, this stop passed without anyone saying anything. It just folded seamlessly into the ongoing conversation. Now, what made this especially dangerous was that the stop itself subtly reframed the situation. It indicated a glitch in the situational awareness of both of these pilots, where they must have assumed that they were now holding short of the departure runway, not the tiny general aviation runway that they were just supposed to cross. On top of this, there was also a more subtle detail working against them, and it had to do with muscle memory. Remember what I said earlier about construction work being underway at the airport? Well, under normal conditions, taxiway Alpha that they were on didn't end at runway 26. It continued beyond it with a gentle left kink of the crossing and then another, very similar gentle left turn right before entering and lining up with runway 22. For pilots who flew out of Lexington, generally, that last line-up turn was familiar and physical, something done by feel as much as by reference. But on this morning, that extension of taxiway Alpha had been closed for reconstruction. So this meant that the pavement ended sooner than it usually did, and another taxiway, formerly called taxiway Alpha 5, had been relabeled as the continuation of taxiway Alpha. So to join this new routing, the captain would have needed to turn left more than he had previously needed to do at that segment, but after the holding point they were now holding at, the steering input required to enter runway 26 was nearly identical to the input he had made countless times before to line up with runway 22. So with the pilots now not paying 100% attention, and after having stopped at the wrong holding point, but with the mental model that they were at the correct one, plus the visual picture also making sense to the captain, the building blocks of disaster had now started to line up. So what other safety barriers were there then that could have stopped it? Well, as I already mentioned, in the tower there was just one single controller on duty this morning, and it had already been a very long night for him. He had been working alone since midnight with only a few hours of sleep before then, so he could have been a little bit fatigued. And he was now responsible not only for the ground movements and takeoff clearances at his airport, but also for radar coordination in the nearby airspace, plus some further administrative tasks. Now, under FAA guidance at the time, Bluegrass Airport was supposed to have two controllers present when tower and the radar responsibilities were combined, but that rule was poorly defined and inconsistently applied, so in practice, overnight and early morning shifts were often staffed by just one person. But this controller was experienced and had been working more than 17 years at Bluegrass Airport, so he was intimately familiar with how departures normally unfolded. During all of that time, he had never seen a commercial airliner attempt to depart from runway 26, so he had no reason to believe that it would happen on this day either. The weather was nice, and two previous departures had already received the same taxi clearance and had departed just fine from runway 22. So he now expected this aircraft to just do the same. And that expectation really mattered, because it shaped what he was looking for, and just as importantly, what he wasn't. At the moment Comair Flight 5191 stopped at the holding point for runway 26, the controller's attention was focused elsewhere. He was just then coordinating a radar handoff for another aircraft that had just departed, and also completing a required traffic count, which was an administrative task that had to be finished before the end of his shift. So Flight 5191 now held its position at the holding point for nearly a minute, which is a relatively long time without anyone pointing out the strangeness of it. Now, if a second set of eyes had been in the tower this morning, they would have likely noticed this, since it was the only movement going on. But this lonely controller was now looking down on his radar scope and flight strips instead, and therefore never saw or realized what was happening. Down in the aircraft, the first officer now made a brief PA, advising passengers that they would be departing shortly. Final tasks were then completed without urgency, with the two pilots getting mentally ready for their takeoff. So when the first officer contacted the tower again, his request sounded completely routine. He advised that Comair 121 was ready for departure, which was actually the wrong call sign, but that also went unnoticed. Instead, the controller now quickly and without hesitation came back with "Runway heading, cleared for takeoff, 191. And if you notice, that clearance didn't include a runway number. So with the clearance received, the captain now released the brakes and the airplane began moving forward. As they turned gently onto the runway ahead, in the same way as the captain thought that he had done many times before, he also now asked for the lineup checklist, to which the first officer responded, "Lineup checks complete," still with no pause or indication that anything felt out of place. The aircraft was soon aligned with the centerline ahead, with the pilots now preparing for their takeoff, fully believing that they were looking down runway 22. But they weren't. Now, if you're sitting in your seat screaming at this point, I kind of understand. How could two experienced, skilled pilots make this mistake? Were there no clues available to show them where they actually were? And yes, in fact, there were many. One of them had been painted on the runway in front of them as they were entering. And these were the large white numbers, reading 26, that would have been clear and unambiguous in daylight, but were maybe harder to recognize at night, and they also disappeared behind the aircraft as it lined up. But on top of that, there was also lit signs on the sides of the taxiways, clearly identifying this as runway 26, but signage only works if it is actively being read, which sadly none of these two pilots now seem to be doing. Even the airplane itself was offering subtle hints. The CRJ's magnetic compass, mounted low on the instrument panel, now indicated a heading roughly 40 degrees away from runway 22's direction. A significant discrepancy, large enough that a deliberate heading check would have caught it instantly. On top of that, the crew had even set their heading bugs on their primary flight displays to the planned runway heading of 227 degrees, which was also the heading that they had been cleared to follow after the takeoff. And had they only checked this, they would have easily seen that same 40-degree discrepancy. But sadly, just like all of the other clues, this now also went unnoticed. Now, Comair didn't have a standard procedure requiring a positive heading cross-check against the bug before departure. At the time, the FAA had recommended that operators should include an explicit heading verification for exactly this type of reason, but Comair hadn't adopted that recommendation. Ironically, the airline's procedures did still require crews to set the runway bugs for the departure runway, meaning that all the information needed was there, straight in front of both pilots, but what was missing was the next step, a verification that would have given that meaning. Anyway, outside the cockpit windows, the darkness now deepened. Like I mentioned before, unlike runway 22, runway 26 had no edge lighting, so there was now no illuminated visual corridor stretching out ahead. Instead, the pavement faded quickly into black, with only the narrow cone of the aircraft's landing lights providing any definition. Under normal circumstances, this absence of light would have been a strong further clue that something just wasn't right here. But remember, the pilots had already discussed that the runway and identifier lights on runway 22 were out of service, and the first officer had personally seen other lights missing on the previous night. So this now meant that the two pilots were primed to expect something different and darker than usual. So it didn't immediately feel wrong. Even the fact that runway 26 was half the width of runway 22 was not enough to raise any alarm bells. Expectation bias is a powerful and very human thing. We are programmed to put more emphasis on the things that confirm our current mental model than what speaks against it. Now, out on the savannah, back in the day, that likely made us more decisive. But in the context of a cockpit, it can be truly devastating, as you're about to see. Every cue this crew now encountered was being filtered through their assumption that they really were on runway 22. And when something didn't quite line up, well, then their subconscious quickly found an explanation for it. Yeah, there was supposed to be less light. This is why robust procedures and cross-checks are so important. You see, a failed cross-check will force you to think, something is wrong here. And that can finally break even the most powerful expectation bias. But inside the cockpit of Flight 5191, the final procedural steps before takeoff now continued without any such cross-checks. Once the aircraft was perfectly lined up, the captain handed over the controls to the first officer, who now called out, "My brakes, my controls." The captain replied, "Your controls." And after that, the first officer stabilized the engines and then moved the thrust levers into the takeoff position. The CRJ's engines responded immediately and the aircraft started lurching forward, accelerating into the deepening darkness ahead. But as they moved, the absence of runway lights now became more pronounced, with the landing lights carving only a narrow tunnel ahead of them. As the seconds ticked by, the takeoff roll likely still felt relatively normal, and there were initially no further hints that they should abort the takeoff. But there were still some clues. Only 10 seconds into the roll, the first officer voiced what his senses were telling him, even if he hadn't yet connected it to a specific threat. "That's weird with no lights," he said, but that's also where that observation ended. Since they were expecting the lack of lights, the first officer comment just drew a soft "yeah" comment from the captain. There was no call to reject, and actually, since this runway was so short, by the time that comment fell, the airplane had already accelerated past the point where a safe rejected takeoff could be performed. The decision window had closed before any of the pilots had even realized that they were in it. And what makes this so heartbreaking is that the clues were everywhere, but none of them were strong enough on their own to break through the expectation bias that these pilots had been under since that first fatal stop. During the following investigation, experts tried to identify the exact moment when the crew's mental picture had quietly slipped out of sync with reality, but they couldn't. At some point, almost certainly while they were chatting away about non-essential stuff rather than monitoring their taxi, the crew's situational understanding had just jumped ahead and moved mentally from "I'm approaching the crossing point of runway 26" to "I'm approaching the holding point for runway 22. The taxi routing was perceived as familiar and super easy, and that comfort had made the violation of sterile cockpit rules seem trivial. So neither pilot had ever stopped, looked up and asked the basic question, "Hey wait, where are we?" And that's what led up to this. Competent pilots losing focus and making a joint single fatal mistake, and then no system in force to catch it. Back on the takeoff roll, the captain now called out 100 knots, to which the first officer replied, "Checks." But outside their windows, the narrow cone of runway illuminated by their landing lights was now coming to an end much sooner than either pilot expected. So just a few seconds later, as the runway end now rushed towards them, the captain called out, "We won, rotate!" But the aircraft hadn't yet reached its calculated rotation speed. This meant that this was likely a distressed emergency call, a last-second attempt to save them from a disaster by forcing the airplane into the air before the pavement ran out before them, but also before the aircraft was fully ready to fly. At this point, their speed was just 131 knots, well short of the calculated rotation speed of 142 knots. Now, if they would have realized their error just a little bit earlier, even if the plane had no room left to stop, the pilots might have been able to firewall the thrust levers and accelerate just a little bit faster. But when this "V1 rotate" call came, it was already too late. Almost immediately after this, the cockpit voice recorder captured the captain exclaiming, "Whoa!" the sound of a man seeing the end of his runway coming towards him. Both pilots now pulled back on their yokes as hard as they could, trying to lift the nose and generate enough lift to climb away. And for a brief instant, the aircraft actually responded, with the nose rising as the CRJ tried to fly. But the main gear was still on the ground when they ran out of runway, and it soon struck an earthen beam beyond the pavement, ripping the landing gear clean off. For a brief moment, the CRJ then actually became airborne, but now damaged and already running out of energy, with the terrain rising ahead of the aircraft in the darkness. It finally struck some trees and then slammed into the ground beyond the airport boundary, with the enormous impact forces tearing it apart as it plowed through the terrain and into a field, scattering debris all around. Almost immediately, fuel released from the ruptured fuel tanks ignited, and the wreckage was consumed by a fire so quickly that there was no time for anyone in the passenger cabin to escape. Inside the tower, the first indication that something was wrong came not as a radio call, but as a sudden absence of what should have been visible. A jet departing runway 22 would normally remain in view for several seconds, climbing straight ahead into the night sky and passing through a predictable corridor beyond the airport. But there was now nothing. No calls and no aircraft. In total, 49 of the 50 people on board were lost in this accident, and the only survivor was the first officer, but he was left with severe injuries that left him unable to walk for the rest of his life, and he would never fly again. He also suffered brain injuries, meaning that he was never able to explain the moment that they had turned onto the wrong runway, since he just couldn't remember the flight at all. And even if he had, it is unlikely that he could have ever articulated the precise moment that the mental slip had occurred. These transactions are not conscious decisions. They happen below the level of awareness, and by the time that you realize that your mental model is wrong, well, then the system has already moved on without you. The National Transportation Safety Board ultimately concluded that the root cause for this accident was simple to state, but harder to explain. The crew had failed to use the cues and aids that were available to them during taxi, and they failed to cross-check and then verify that they were lined up on the correct runway before takeoff. And when investigators looked for the reasons why those cues didn't break through, they found the same pattern repeating itself in different forms. A cockpit that had drifted away from disciplined monitoring during the most critical phase of ground movement, and a wider system relying almost entirely on human beings being able to spontaneously catching a mistake. Two contributing factors stood out. One was the conversation in the cockpits, because the recording makes clear that the crew's attention was being spent on topics that had nothing to do with operational matters. Investigators pointed out that this kind of non-essential talk during taxi is exactly what sterile cockpit rules were designed to prevent. The other factor was structural. Under the procedures in place at the time, a taxi clearance could implicitly authorize a crossing of intervening runways without requiring the controller to issue a specific crossing clearance. And the NTSB concluded that this policy removed an important layer of forced awareness at the exact moment that it mattered the most. In the aftermath, Comair revised its guidance to include departure runway verification, essentially putting into writing what had previously been treated as something obvious. This finally forced crews to look up, look out, and confirm deliberately that they were actually on the correct runway, no matter how obvious it might have felt. In the years that followed, US air traffic procedures also moved steadily away from the idea of assumed clearances. Controllers were directed to use explicit language when an aircraft needed to cross a runway, issuing clear instructions like "cross runway 26" rather than assuming anything. At the same time, guidance was also tightened to discourage takeoff clearances that omitted the runway number, removing one more opportunity for assumption to stand in for verification. Now, all of these changes made aviation safer and were also reinforced by a broader push to try and reduce runway incursions nationwide and also beyond. Airports expanded the use of improved runway signage and markings. Controllers received additional training focused specifically on surface operations, and technology like surface movement radar and runway status lights began to spread beyond the larger airport hubs. Each of these measures addressed a different layer of the problem, but they all stemmed from the same lesson, underscored by this accident. Once an aircraft is moving on the ground, a misunderstanding can quickly become dangerous, and a system that depends on someone just noticing a mistake in time is not a system designed for failure tolerance. Thank you all for watching, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Now, if you want to see my next video before everyone else and also take part in my next Zoom hangout, then scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I would love to see you there. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.